Dr. Fain, again, thank you for coming back to speak with us. Dr. Fain is a third generation Black Huntingtonian. He is the recipient of the Carter G. Woodson Fellowship from Marshall and received his MA and PhD in history from the Ohio State University. His teaching career includes positions at Marshall, Niagara University, and his current position as professor at the College of Southern Maryland as a faculty member and member of the Male Student of Color Mentee program. He has authored several articles in peer-reviewed journals, including Buffalo Soldier, Deserter Criminal, Remarkably Complicated Life of Charles Ringo, in the Ohio Valley Journal, which is his current book project. His first book, Black Huntington, an Appalachian Story, was published in May 2019 by the University of Illinois Press. Dr. Fain has also been a contributing historian to It's Time to Talk About West Virginia Slaves by Nicholas Brumfield, January 29, 2019 reviewer, The African Blood Brotherhood in the West Virginia Coalfields, West Virginia History, a Journal of Regional Studies, April 2018, reviewer reading the Storer Record, Education, Race, and John Brown in the Storer College newspaper, West Virginia History, a Journal of Regional Studies, January 2017. So Dr. Fain, thank you again. And we're so excited to have you back with us. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Nice to see folks back again. I guess many of you back again from the first presentation. I have a couple of updates that I wanted to share with you. Number one, I've been going by the third generation. I recently realized that I'm a fourth generation Black Huntingtonian. My great-grandmother and great-grandfather are buried out at Bethel Memorial Cemetery. And I hope that folks are aware of Bethel Memorial Cemetery. That's behind, it's past Spring Hill Cemetery, behind Whitmere. And there have been some efforts lately to clean up the area, assisted by Marshall University and community members. And I recently went out there, and for some reason, my brain kind of locked. I knew the gravestones were there, but I didn't realize, it didn't click over to me that I'm a fourth generation. My great-grandfather being born in 1873, my great-grandmother 1879, thereabouts. And so it just reinstills a real deep respect and roots to Huntington. And then I don't know if I told you that I won the West Virginia Literary Award. Did I mention that to you last time, Elizabeth?
I can't remember. I don't know. That
okay. The West Virginia Library Association awarded the book their Literary Merit Award at a ceremony in mid-October. And so I'm the first African-American since Henry Louis Gates, first state African-American, state native to receive this award. And I'm very gratified about it. And so it just reaffirms what I thought was important in listening to the poor stories and having it come kind of full circle. So I just wanted to mention that to everyone.
That's very nice.
Thank you so much. And so we're going to begin with, I'm going to give a kind of a broad outline of what today's talk, which is really about the entrepreneurial spirit related to the first and second generation of Black migrants into Huntington. I think it is something that is a story that is kind of maybe generally known, in a kind of nebulous, amorphous type of way, but not really chronicled in a concise, concrete way. And I think it's important to realize that the barriers that were the institutional racism, the occupational barriers, Jim Crow era, were impediments, certainly, to Black progress and aspirations, but it didn't completely block them from pursuing other pathways that allowed them to move forward individually, as families, and as a community. And one of the ways would be engaging in entrepreneurial activities. Now, entrepreneurial activities is, you know, it can be, is when I mention that, it's important to realize that it's not only what legal entrepreneurial activities, but of course some of them might be extra legal. Um, you know, so that's always been a part of America, you know, and so when folks get blocked, when one pathway gets blocked, folks seek out other pathways. That's part of that's what has made America such a dynamic, interesting place. So that gives you some background. I want to start off with really Nelson Barnett. I don't know if folks know about, you know about the Barnett School, of course. And you may not, you know, Nelson Barnett, the Barnett Center is named after him. And Nelson Barnett was, let me start off with this little story. He was anxious but confident. In 1871, he had left his family behind to walk hundreds of miles from Buckingham County, Virginia, to start a new life. And now, after several tiring days, he had arrived with other migrants, and they were broke but prayerful. As a man of the cloth, he had preached throughout the Ohio Valley, and one of the places where he first preached would be Macedonian Missionary Baptist Church in Burlington, Ohio. And many of you may know the story of Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church. It is essentially the mother church for Black churches within the Ohio Valley. Churches out of Ironton, throughout Lawrence and Gallia County, as well as the First Baptist Church in Huntington, will be spawned from that church. And that, you know, churches have historically been centers of activism, restoration, spiritual nourishment, religious debate and discussion, political discussions as well, sense of community, all those things. And so from here, from these humble beginnings, really in the Macedonian Missionary Baptist Church, there would be a Providence Missionary Baptist Association by which other member churches would join, and Reverend Nelson Barnett would travel to these churches and preach. And through these connections, he would gain a sense of what the lay of the land, so to speak, and get a chance to meet like-minded people, other migrants, aspirational people, talented people, and begin to formulate ideas about how best to exist in this new environment called Huntington, West Virginia. Now, let me see here. He would acquire a job on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, and then eventually go back, travel back to Buckingham County, and then through a wagon train, essentially, travel back with other migrants, and they would start the job on Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. And over the next few months and years, he and others like him would be joined by hundreds and thousands of people affiliated with the construction of the C&O Railroad through the Great New River Valley. And they would start life at the bottom. So many of them would start life at the bottom of the economic ladder. But the traits that they had acquired through their years of slavery, resourcefulness, ingenuity, and self-sufficiency, these characteristics, these traits will carry them forward and allow them to climb the ladder, build families, build homesteads, and combat rough times. These Black migrants, and as well as residents of Cabot County, there have been a residential population in Guyandotte and Barbersville for quite some time. And they would become the first generation of Black workers, laborers. And they would engage in a labor to get a foothold on the economic ladder. Now, we really don't have, we're talking the 1870s and 1880s, we really don't have much of an entrepreneurial presence at this time. Huntington is developing, Chesapeake and Ohio is still developing. And so what we really have for the most part are laborers who are laboring. It's really when we get into the late 1880s, early 1890s, that we begin to see a kind of the economy spreading out and offering opportunities for entrepreneurship within Huntington's within Huntington proper. And you begin to see Dan Hill, Huntington's first taxi driver. This is pictures taken in 1905. He appears, I think, in the 1890s. This is Huntington's first taxi driver. You're going to have barbers. You're going to have drovers. You're going to have washers and porters, seamstresses, contractors. And these folks begin to build homes. They open grocery stores and restaurants and soup kitchens and bars. Some of the bars were certainly not exactly where the respectful folks went, let's say. Some of them were, dens of vice, unquestionably. Now, one of the things about Barnett, and the reason why I start off with him is, his efforts and his travels allow him to gain greater knowledge, insight into opportunities. And so he begins really what we might call a start of a Black mercantile business, which he organized and serviced a group of country stores of the fruit stand variety in and around the Ohio, Tug, and Kanawha valleys. His great-great-grandson told me that in essence, this endeavor appears to be kind of like a modern day, what we would call a modern day independent grocers association. And so that to me is an example of ingenuity and the ability of, the result of an insight and intelligence, and then utilizing those contacts that he's made to kind of help him build a mercantile business. Now, we know that this is going to be a slow process. Dan Hill, R.E.L. Washington, the Huntington's first architect, other folks are, and barbers and things like that. All these people, as well as women who are engaging in entrepreneurial activities or assisting their husband in entrepreneurial activities. This is going to be a slow process. And so really the first generation of Black Huntingtonians lays the foundation. It's the second generation that they begin to reap the harvest of their labors. The children begin to go to college, and the development of a professional class that takes place during this in the late 1890s and early 20th century. One of the challenges really is, and one of the criticisms that this one gentleman, folks may know that there is a Scott Community Center on 9th Avenue. And Professor Scott was a black migrant from Henrico County in Virginia, arrived in the city in the early 1890s. And in 1900, he was the co-founder, and the co-editor of the West Virginia Spokesman, Huntington's first black newspaper, started by C.H. Barnett, son of Reverend Nelson Barnett, and the brother of Dr. C.C. Barnett, and principal of Douglas High School at the time. In 1905, he became the principal of Douglas High School. And in 1911, he wrote an important pamphlet that I have, which is called The Progress of the Huntington Negro. And what he's doing is essentially looking at the progress of Huntington Negro through a black middle class lens. And he's critiquing that first generation by saying that they had gotten out of the cellar, so to speak, and that means much. And he talks about their eyes are beginning to open. The proverbial short-sightedness of the first Negro settlers who refused to buy real estate when land was cheap was a racial blunder from which we suffer today. Yet a few who brought their families or who married out here were wise enough to buy homes. Well, the truth of the matter is there was no short-sightedness. I critique Professor Scott's contention here. I critique it rather harshly because in truth of the matter is you got a first generation of migrants who are black migrants who are just removed from slavery. They've got nothing but their labor. And so it's going to take them time to build up the economic reserves to move forward. And the acquisition of land, when most of the land has at this particular time been acquired by the C&O Railroad or other long-term families that have been here. And so the real options for Black people to purchase land are outside of the city proper. Or in the new neighborhoods that are forming, Walnut Hills, as an example, Fifth Street Road. And so there are a few long-termers, Black long-term folks, Black residents who have been here, who are able to acquire land, but they're few and far between. Now, one of the things that I think is important is, Professor Scott is embracing his maxims of good citizenship, and this is essentially, many of you have heard of the racial uplift movement. This is the racial uplift movement of the Jim Crow era. Instead of waiting for, we're living in a segregated society at this era, and so the philosophy is that Black folks can lift up their own selves up by engaging in certain actions and philosophies. And so Professor Scott puts forth his 10 maxims of good citizenship, and you can see them there. And they're not, tell you the truth, they're pretty relevant to today, actually. I wish I had been able to follow a few of them a little bit better, at times, especially that leave liquor severely alone. I kind of, we'll save that for another conversation. But in any event, these are examples of the Black middle class mantras and philosophies, and they are sound philosophies, I think, for any people. And so But they also speak of a middle class judgment that says if you don't abide by these principles, you're somehow being remiss, you're somehow less moral. And I think that needs to be acknowledged that many Black working class folks and white working class didn't necessarily want to be held to such strictures. They wanted to go out and have fun, drink, party, not necessarily go to church. And so what I'm getting at here is that we have the development of the Black professional class also bespeaks of a class stratification that is taking place. And certainly, the development of bars and what we can call dens of iniquity, or examples of Black working class people saying, hey, look, we're not going to be beholden to these type of strictures. We're, for whatever reason, we choose or we're not allowed to engage in the formal economic and legitimate economy. We're going to shift our goals and aspirations into a alternative economy. And that alternative economy is a very appealing option for many people, because it gives those who don't have an education, who may not have as much talent or family resources available, it gives them an opportunity to be entrepreneurs. Now, I talked about one of the things that begins to occur is that Professor Scott is correct that the best way to move forward is, for many, if you're blocked from acquiring positions of authority in the burgeoning industries and manufacturing industries that take place in Huntington that are growing, the best way to move forward, and many Black families decide that, look, we can't make any real progress politically. The numbers just don't, the demographics just don't bear that out in the municipal politics. We can't do anything within the industries because, again, the power structure is aligned against us. So what is the most available route for us to move forward individually, as families, and as a community to move forward? Well, it ends up being property acquisition. And it's interesting that, we all know about Carter G. Woodson and his family, the Woodsons and the Barnetts. Well, between 1906 and 1914, the Woodson and Barnett families purchased 17 residential properties within this all-Black enclave called Washington Place that I'll show you a little bit later. Washington Place is an all-Black residential neighborhood which is located where close to where White Way Cleaners is now. For those who could not afford to purchase land or a house within Washington Place, many of them went outside, again, as I said, outside the city limits. And I quote a gentleman, Walter Myers, who talks about my father and aunts told me that most of the Blacks could not buy property in what is known as the flatlands from the Guyan River to 12 Pole. They had to buy property on the hill. The flatlands were farmlands all around this area, and they brought property along 5th Street Hill, Spring Hill, and Walnut Hills. They lived in all of that area up until nearly the 30s, excuse me. They had hundreds of acres out there, beautiful land. It's still beautiful land. my grandparents owned most of Walnut Hills area, and a lady named Mrs. Black owned from the boulevard, Hal Greer Boulevard, then 16th Street Boulevard, past 18th Street. She owned all that area. In addition to purchasing lots in Central City and Huntington, some in conjunction with her husband, C.S. McLean, during the late 1890s and early 1900s, Mary E. McLean purchased 2 one-acre plots of land behind Spring Hill Cemetery, adjacent to Norway Avenue, one in 1907, the other in 1914, on which Bethel Crossroads Cemetery will be established. This is Bethel Memorial Cemetery. By 1920, Bethel serves as the primary burial site for C.S. McLean and Fred, his 18-year-old son, who were Huntington's first Black undertakers. Again, entrepreneurship, business building. I'm still trying to figure out the timeline, the chronology of the development of Bethel as a formal cemetery, because as I said, the headstones of my great-grandfather and great-grandmother have 1873 and 1879. And so I'm trying to figure out how in the world could they be buried there prior to it being established. I don't know what the funeral practices were back in the day, but it's widely reported that this cemetery wasn't established until I believe of 1927. And I've got to do a little bit more investigation to see the contradictions here. But I'm certainly gratified. If you've never visited Bethel Cemetery, it has been, greatly cleaned up. And it is so gratifying to see that. And hopefully we can find a long-term endowment can be established to ensure that it is maintained and upkept and hopefully restored. And then perhaps it can become a tourist destination, a cultural heritage site. I do believe that they believe maybe 600 to 800 bodies are buried there. So I talked about this professional class and this entrepreneurial spirit. Well, I'm sure many of you know about C.C. Barnett, Dr. Barnett, who established the Barnett Hospital and Nursing School, and the building still stands on 7th Avenue. Karen Nance, local historian Karen Nance, has been just so critical in its upkeep, and hopefully she can, she can get some assistance, and we can salvage that building. I don't know about the restoration, but certainly salvage it. And again, there would be another example of the rich Black history and heritage that exists in this city. So the racial uplift era coincides with this kind of the Black hospital movement and Black nursing movement that takes place in the early part of the 20th century. It bespeaks of a growing assertiveness, increasing cultural maturation, and racial solidarity, largely in the Black middle class again. This is Black churches. The Douglas High School certainly embody and embrace this racial uplift. There is the development in this era of the NAACP, which is an example of an interclass membership, which is important to realize. And so we have the development of a Black professional class that I've talked about: teachers, doctors, attorneys, and barbers. There's the maturation of Black institutions, churches, Ebenezer, First Baptist, as the two primary examples. you have benevolent and fraternal organizations, and you have Douglas High School. Black Hospital Movement, the creation of Barnett Hospital and Nursing School by Dr. C.C. Barnett and his wife, his second wife, Clara Barnett, really incredibly important and well regarded. I mean, he's training doctors that will serve at Tuskegee and Boston and other locales, and she's training nurses that will travel, that will serve around the nation. Another example of Black entrepreneurship would be the creation of the Colored Orphans Home, which existed on Route 60 for a time. While not exactly entrepreneurial, there is movement. This example of the increasing assertiveness is the movement into the public space. There is actually a cliff. Black Huntingtonians could not go to Ritter Park, and so they could go to Cliffside Park, which was located in Ashland, Kentucky, and there's a small sign that still exists. I haven't been in Ashland in a while, and I can't think exactly the street, but there's a small sign that exists outside of an industrial park that carries that indicates that Cliffside Park was once located here. And so folks may know that we had the streetcar system that traveled from Huntington, I believe, to past Camden Park, over to Catlettsburg, over to Ashland and Ironton. There was a conglomeration of various businesses that were able to construct this streetcar system for a time. And so Black folks could travel from Ironton to Huntington and back. Just an amazing thing, I think, for the early 1900s in any city, but certainly in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. And so I talk about this kind of Grand Cakewalk. Grand Cakewalk was a competition that took place. And it was a dancing competition, and whoever won it got a cake. That's why they called it a Grand Cakewalk. Well, supposedly, and some of these things you have to take for a grain of salt, there was a huge Grand Cakewalk that existed, comprised of 5,000 Black folks from Ironton, Ashland, and Huntington, as well as the surrounding areas, that participated and competed in this Grand Cakewalk. I don't know who won, but that must have been a hell of a large cake. Or hopefully maybe several large cakes were delivered. But it speaks to the fact that the Black people of the era were not going to allow themselves to be completely constrained by Jim Crow era machinations and constraints. They're going to move into the public arena. And so there's also the increase in Black female-centered endeavors and activism that takes place. Revella Hughes, who was a Douglas graduate, famous opera singer, who was known internationally as Carmela Douche, relied upon these Black female-centered connections, network, that allowed her to leave Huntington, to go to school in Richmond, acquire an education, musical education, and then travel the world, and then come back and start the music department at Douglas. There's also increased political activity and agitation. There's the colored independent Republican ticket. I mentioned the West Virginia spokesman started by C.H. Barnett and J.W. Scott. It is important to realize that that newspaper was shut down by the Board of Education because in essence, they gave the two teachers, the principal and the vice principal at that time, a choice. Either you give up the newspaper or you will resign from your positions at Douglas High School. And they both resigned. And that's how Carter G. Woodson becomes the principal. Here's Washington Place. Here's 16th Street, 9th Avenue, 10th Avenue. So it's right across. There's 10th Avenue passing through. I believe Douglas High School will be over here. Douglas School. So this was one way for Black people to move up the economic ladder. It was an interesting, but it's an interesting development because white real estate developers had what's the word? Dual purposes in the construction of Washington Place. Number one, it allowed Black people to segregate themselves into a Black residential neighborhood. Yes, Black people could buy property, but they had to buy it in this neighborhood because, of course, they couldn't buy it in white neighborhoods because of the restrictive covenants that existed. And so, for Black people, it provided an opportunity to move up the economic ladder by purchasing a property. But for whites, it allowed them to have some degree of comfort that we're giving them this option, and then that way we don't have to worry about them moving into our neighborhoods. Additionally, it separated out the Black middle class, those who could afford to buy a property in Washington Place, from the Black working class, those who could not afford to buy within Washington Place. And so complicated dynamics there. And in fact, some Blacks, with the help of the NAACP, pushed back against moving in or allowing that to be the sole place where Black people could purchase land. Because in essence, and at the municipal level, this took place in Bluefield and it took place, I believe, in Beckley. Black property, those who sought to acquire Black property or property were signing off on the contention that they were happy then acquiescing to the prevailing restrictive covenants and racial status code that existed. And Huntingtonians, Black Huntingtonians said, no, we're not going to sign off on that. We're not going to acquiesce to just purchasing property solely here. We want the ability to purchase property wherever we want to. Interesting dynamics there for sure. What we need to understand is, though, despite the challenges and the impediments, Black entrepreneurship and home acquisition does continue throughout as Huntington's burgeoning economy diversifies and opportunities present themselves, Black people take advantage of it. And so by I already talked about the Woodsons and the Barnetts purchasing 17 residential properties. Well, by 1921, you have 8 Black contractor businesses, 6 barbershops, 5 hairdressing emporiums, 4 pressing and cleaning shops, 3 Black real estate companies, 2 shoe repair shops, 2 printing companies, and a movie house. And there's a vigorous interracial home ownership campaign that results in this era. And it's interesting, interracial home ownership campaign that results in the purchase of 67 homes and lots throughout the city. I mean, you think about this in conjunction with the nature of Fairfield West community now, and the shame of the properties the large number of properties that are in disrepair. But for a time there was just a vitality that existed. By 1924, 60% of African Afro-Huntingtonians owned their own homes, 60%, a higher figure than either the Black residents of Clarksburg or Charleston. Their aggregate worth of Black real estate holdings was approximately $1,400,000, a significant increase from the roughly $400,000 total worth cited by Professor Scott a decade earlier. Of the 483 homes owned, an average number of rooms per house was 5.5. Average number of persons per household, 3.9, 1.2 less than the city average. So what we have then here is evidence of the fruit of their labors paying off, family stability being achieved, economic resources, entrepreneurial activities being proven out. And this is a strategy, a successful strategy that says, okay, look, we don't have to be, if we can't move forward politically within the city, if we can't move forward within the acquiring jobs of authority, if we can't unionize, there was, it is important to realize that there was no real Black union presence or even effort, whether it was Black or interracial. So this seems to be a really savvy way to move forward. And is the embodiment of racial uplift philosophy. In 1926, the famous reporter George Schuler, who was working for, he had been a World War I reporter, I do believe, and he's the Pittsburgh Courier. This is a Black, arguably one of the top Black newspapers of the era, with the Chicago Defender, the Richmond Bee. George Schuler sent throughout, his assignment is to travel through West Virginia and give your observations, report your observations. And he comes to Huntington in 1926. And he reiterates the positive portrait of Black Huntington's progress, writing, over 60% of the colored families own their houses in which they live. Most of the Negroes have steady work on the railroad or in big shops of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. Many work steadily for the municipality, collecting garbage and trash, and there are close to 50 barbers who don't appear to be clasping the lean hand of want. Moreover, the relations between whites and Negroes are very cordial, and Negro businesses can always count upon the patronage of whites in West Virginia, no matter how strong the spirit of the Ku Klux Klan may be otherwise. And so I think he encapsulates this progress exceedingly well that has taken place in 2 generations, maybe the 3rd generation by this time, of Black Huntington presence. One of the critiques of my book is, by a couple of reviewers, is that I stopped it in 1929 without really giving a reason as to why I stopped it in 1929. And that's a fair critique. I should have at least explored how the Great Depression would have impacted. We can certainly speculate and then have an informed speculation on a general impact it would have on Black entrepreneurship and Black property acquisition. And I wish I had done that. And I might just, that'll be the 2nd book on Black Huntington. But at this time, by the time we get around to 1929, which is where my book ends, there is great optimism the Black Huntingtonians have. And I like to leave it there. So I thank you all for your presence and your attention. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And I'll certainly open to taking some questions if folks have any.
You're muted, Diane.
Am I still here, by the way?
Yeah, you are. You're still here. I think Diane's
Okay.
trying to ask a question, but they're muted. There
Okay.
they go. There you are.
No, I just thought it was a very interesting presentation. And if you would speculate, if you were to write a second book,
Yes.
where would you, well, you'd start, I guess, where you ended in 29.
Yes.
And would you go with the second and third generation, and how do you see those changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, unquestionably, the Great Depression would have impacted Black aspiration and status, unquestionably, just like it impacted people across the nation, and certainly Black communities and families nationwide. I probably would. It's, I think, the key touchstones would be, of course, the impact of the Great Depression, World War II. I had family who fought in World War II. I certainly would like to see what would be the reception of Black soldiers back into Huntington. What would that have been like? And certainly the development of the early civil rights era. Some of you know that my dad was a member of the civil rights movement, the Civic Interest Progressives, which was an interracial group that protested against segregation within restaurants, the White Pantry. I would probably, and I probably would stop it. Probably stop it in the 1980s or 90s. I would, and I'll just say that speculatively, because by that time Huntington's decline is clearly demarcated. From the 60s to the 90s, we're losing massive amounts of people to outmigration, and so I would like to see what was the status of Black Huntingtonians. I mean, we know that there's outmigration. We know that there's the influx of crime and drugs that accompany that outmigration, and that's probably where I was stop. Excuse me. But who knows? There's a lot there. And I'm really gratified to know that to discover that, students over at Marshall have done additional research that has helped me out. I mean, I've learned a lot of things since I've been back, and things that I wish I had put into the book, but at a certain point you just can't throw everything in there.
Cicero.
Does that help answer the question?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Cicero.
Hey, Sarah.
Hi. I know that they've been working, and I know Lori Thompson's been working, and a lot of members of the community to centralize the collection of photographs.
Yes.
That is a visual representation of a lot of what you talk about in your book.
Yeah.
And I wondered if and maybe as part of why you're here, give you a little extra job. There could ever be some type of, with archives and special collections, and in cooperation with the entire Huntington community, to have some type of exhibit of the visual pictures along with the written word, so that people can see. I love those maps, that are in your book and you were putting up there, that allowed me to be able to see where that was and where it is today. I just wonder if that's anywhere on a back burner possibility in the future.
Yes, sir, it is. And that's, if I had pushed a little bit more with the University of Illinois Press, I would have definitely put in more pictures. I mean, that's been one of the critiques, and again, a fair critique. But they pushed back and said, of course, every picture you put in costs money, and I had another 10 to 15 pictures I could have easily have put in, but they pushed back, and so I acquiesced. but yeah, I've talked to Kelly Johnson, I've talked to Lori, I've talked to Dr. Dolores Johnson. Um, um, you know, we donated, when I say we, Mrs. Emma Barnett, who was married to Nelson Barnett, the great grandson of Nelson Barnett, donated pictures. The last time, it would have been 2019, donated photographs. I mean, a good, I don't know, 7, 8 boxes of photographs from the 1920s and 30s. Because there was a photographer, whose name escapes me now, unfortunately. And so we've got a treasure trove of photographs to bring to bear and to show the visual, to give that visual representation. My hope would be, and my goal is, you know, in conjunction with Marshall and community members and city leaders, is to establish a tri-state African American Heritage Center. I think I mentioned it. I don't know if I mentioned it or not here, on Howard Greer Boulevard. And that would be, you know, it would be a living museum, have a multifunctional facility. And that would be the repository, the central repository of course, assuming that Marshall would give up, you know, some of their ownership, we could partner. That would be the central repository of Black Huntington memorabilia, documentation, and the chronicling of the historical presence of Black folks within the city and the region. And my goal is to get it established by 2026. And so that would be the 150th anniversary, I do believe, of Carter G. Woodson. And so anyone out there who wants to assist or who's interested in that, please keep it in mind. And so, Sarah, I'm with you. We're working on it. I've had those conversations with Lori and Kelly, and it is a goal.
Well, you know, maybe a permanent loan for Marshall, because if you keep that connection with Marshall, they have some responsibility for the taking care of it as well.
Correct. Yes.
I would have influence in that, but but remember that when you ask them.
Thank you. Yeah. And especially now that we have our new president of you know, from Cerrito, an Appalachian, hopefully he will see the wisdom of that.
Okay, now I'm from Canova and he's from Canova.
Okay, Canova, not Cerrito.
Yeah.
Okay.
Professor Fain.
Sorry, yes.
Thank you for. I was intrigued by your the notion, or the concept that Black Huntingtonians refuse, or we're kind of living with this notion we're not going to get boxed, for lack of a better way to say, boxed in. I got so excited about Huntington's African American history before you came, when my grandson in the Regents Bachelor of Arts program was taking African American studies and worked with the professor regarding Clio, and he had to do 3 postings, and he did it on markers in the block over in Charleston.
Sure.
And in fact, the African American grouping over there that has done which I'm so excited to hear about what you're passionate about in 2026 around the holdings here. But the block over in Charleston seemed to be just the opposite of what I guess was happened in Huntington. Am I right from what you're saying? I mean,
I don't know that much about the block. You know, we had the block in Huntington as well, on 8th Avenue. And
we're entrepreneurs, basically, pretty much.
Sure. I mean, I remember the block. You know, from let's say, oh boy, I want to go perhaps Dalton Avenue, you know, along 16th Street, Dalton Avenue up to 8th Avenue, extending perhaps to, I want to say maybe 17th Street. just where just where the Scott Community Center is now, that was a whole area of entrepreneurial businesses. Fish shops, cafes, shoe repair shop, bars, nightclubs, mom and pop shops. I remember those. The sad truth of the matter is, but that's the reality, is that no community is immune from larger forces at play.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, if you have dying industries, just look at, this era of the 70s, Pittsburgh and Youngstown, Ohio, Toledo, Ohio, Huntington, perhaps Charleston as well, Beckley, Bluefield, all those areas that were dependent upon coal and industry and manufacturing, all of them, when those businesses leave, folks you either got to find a job in where you live, or you move on and find jobs where they exist. And for the most of us, like me, I mean, part of my aspirations to get out was to find a job, that I couldn't find here. I don't know that much. I know was the block a positive place, or was it somewhat of a red light district?
Oh no, it was a real positive.
Okay.
In fact, if you go to Clio and some of the articles that are there, and if you look up on Clio, look for the historical marker. My grandson Wilson, his last name.
Yes.
He did the piece on the block historical marker. And of course, then there's other, of course, buildings and historical sites in there. But unfortunately, of course, urban renewal and highway system and all this.
I do know that was
like what you
right. I know that was a big part of it. But
I just was intrigued by what you said in relation to the strategy, which is what we need to hear. The strategy of that second generation.
Yeah. And I would dare say it was probably not that different from what's happening in Charleston. To some extent, I'm going back to George Schuler. His report on Charleston was really interesting because he said Charleston had a much more progressive Negro population than that of Huntington. And I can't remember why he said that, what were the rationale or the reasons behind it. But when I talk to my dad or other Black Huntingtonians, they will all say the same thing. That's one of the things that kind of holds Huntington back to some extent, is this is a more for the traditional, whatever that means, population, as opposed to Charleston be more progressive. But one of the things I lament is that there hasn't been anyone has done a scholarly study of Black Charleston. And it needs to be done. It is a real void, because it's different than Huntington, of course. It's a different history, and so maybe someone, I'm not going to do it. I'll tell you that right now, but hopefully someone will at some point. Yeah. Thank you for the question,
Cicero. I got here late. I'm sorry I missed the first part. I read your book.
Thank you so much.
After hearing you speak at the Library Association, is very interesting. It's a monumental research task. It's amazing.
Thank you.
It got me thinking about, I've been here 50 years or so in Huntington, and the number of outstanding African-American people.
Yes.
Really need to look at that. In those years, Joe Slash and Bill Smith as superintendents of school.
Yes.
Bill Williams was mayor. Sandra Clements was an outstanding city council. Herb Henderson.
Sure.
On and on and on. A bunch of people at Marshall, just a bunch of people in the whole community. Is anybody going to be doing something like that? That would be a wonderful part of your
We're working on it. I mean, we're working on it. All those people that you mentioned were family friends. All the people are our family friends. I just spoke to Sandra yesterday, matter of fact.
She's wonderful.
Yes. And so, I think I'll give Dr. Gilbert great credit for bringing me back because he realized I've got a deep rootedness and a love for this community. And I am really hopeful. I have Joe Slash's number. Joe's, he's on my, he's at the top of the list. I got somebody to contact. Joe Williams is a family friend. Herb Henderson was a family friend. It's just these, as you say, these are people who indelibly imprinted my life because they provided me models of Black excellence.
To the whole community.
And to the whole community. You're right.
Community.
You're right.
That's so important.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And so when I could grow up, when I was growing up, I could go and see a Joe Slash or Herb Henderson or Joe Williams or Dr. Dolores Cleckley, Sylvia Ridgway. These are people that, weren't some like Oprah Winfrey person way out in the stratosphere. These are folks right in my community who are achieving great things. And unquestionably, they impacted me and inspired me. And so the goal is for as best as I can to align with these folks that are still here, both Black and white, and who recognize that the partnerships and the need for a permanent homage and recognition and acknowledgement of the presence of Black folks and contributions is incredibly important. I'll say one last thing. That I went to the home production, 150-year production at the Keith Albee a couple of weeks ago, and I was disappointed that that production was about Collis P. Huntington and his group, as opposed to recognizing the importance of the common man and woman in building up this city. As well as there was a visual, I don't know if anyone went to this show, there was also visual representation. The show was great, the music was fantastic. But you cannot have a show that chronicles 150 years of Huntington's history without explicitly mentioning Black presence and contributions. You can't. And so I was disappointed. I wrote one of the people involved in the show, told them that as diplomatic as I can, because I'm not going to demonize these folks. I just said, you missed an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so, to not have a visual representation of the First Baptist Church, J.W. Scott Center, Ebenezer Center, the mural, anything, Carter G. Woodson statue, Douglas High School, that I'd have those visual representations does a disservice to us all. So I'll leave it there.
Well, I was on Zoom, Paul,
No.
I think that's Bert's phone beeping. Do we have any other questions or comments for Dr. Fain? I don't see any. Well, Dr. Fain, thank you again for taking the time to speak with us. It was another great presentation.
Thank you all so much. You folks are so kind. I really appreciate your interest and your questions. I need you moving forward. And so please keep me in mind as I move forward and we get a little bit greater presence, in progress and in these aspirations. Hopefully we can accomplish this great goal, and because what happens is that what happens in Huntington, and what the same thing, I'm actually attending a meeting next week in which Ironton and Lawrence County is trying to do the same thing that we're trying to do. Leverage the history, the Black history and culture of Lawrence County, centered around the Underground Railroad there, which of course extends into Huntington and Cabot County and Wayne County. And so we all recognize that if we can leverage the history and the culture, we all benefit. Mm-hmm. We all benefit. So I thank you all for your time and interest. I wish you the best in the holidays, and be safe and be well.
Thank you. And the very same to you. And, you know, if there's a time you want to come back and speak with us some more, if as you get moving on this idea,
Okay.
we'd be happy to have you back at any time.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.